Every train you've ever seen works the same way. A wheel gripping a rail. From old steam trains to modern bullet trains, the basic idea hasn't really changed in more than 200 years. But somewhere near Mount Fuji, in a long concrete trench, there is a train with no wheels touching anything at all. It floats, about 10 centimeters above the ground, held up by nothing you can see. And it doesn't crawl. It has been clocked at 603 kilometers an hour, faster than most people ever expect a train could go. That isn't a camera trick, it's just physics. A machine weighing hundreds of tons, moving faster than most trains ever will, suspended above the track without a wheel touching the rail. Japan has spent more than 60 years chasing this, and the better part of $100 billion building it. 60 years? $100 billion. Just to lift a train off the ground and let it fly. But here's the part almost nobody talks about. Japan isn't pouring 60 years and $100 billion into this train because it wants to be fast. It's building it out of fear. Fear of something it knows is coming and cannot stop. So what is Japan really bracing for? We'll come back to what Japan is really afraid of. But to understand the train, you first have to understand a problem every other train on Earth runs into and never gets past. Start with the obvious question. We already have bullet trains. They're fast. So why not just build a faster one? It feels like speed should work like a budget. Want to go faster? Add more power? Build a sleeker train? Spend more money? And for decades, that seemed to work. Every new generation pushed the limit a little further until one day, it didn't. But then they stopped. Not because engineers ran out of money, not because they ran out of ideas. They hit a real physical wall, and it was hiding in the last place anyone expected. Here's the thing nobody tells you about trains. A train moves because its wheels grip the rail and push. That grip is friction. And friction is the entire trick. No grip, no push, no train. It's the thing that makes the whole machine work. But friction has a dark side. The faster the wheel spins, the more that grip begins to fail. It stops biting cleanly into the rail and starts to slip like tires struggling for grip on an icy road. Push harder and everything gets worse. More slipping, more heat, more wear, more noise. Somewhere around 350 to 360 kilometers an hour, a steel wheel on a steel rail stops being worth the fight. You're battling the very thing that was supposed to move you forward. Sit with that for a second, because it's stranger than it sounds. The wheel that lets a train move is the very thing that stops it from going faster. The tool became the ceiling. You can't spend your way past it, because the limit isn't in the budget, it's in the physics. That's why the fastest bullet trains have largely stopped getting faster. Engineers can polish them, quiet them, and make them more efficient. But they can't push them through that wall because the wall isn't in the engine. It's in the tiny patch where steel meets steel, which leaves only one way out. If the problem is that the train touches the ground, then the answer is a train that doesn't touch it at all. But that solution hands you a far crazier problem, because now you have to take a machine as heavy as a loaded airliner, lift the entire thing off the track, and hold it there rock steady while it screams along at 600 kilometers an hour, on nothing but air. So how do you hold a train up in nothing but air? For a long time, that sounded less like engineering and more like a magic trick. Start with the obvious idea: magnets. We've all played with them, and we all know how unpredictable they can be. Push two together, and one twists, flips, or shoots sideways. So the idea of supporting a train weighing hundreds of tons on magnets doesn't just sound difficult, it sounds dangerous. One sudden wobble, and you'd expect the whole thing to smash into the wall. But that's the first assumption the engineers threw away. They never tried to balance the train in the first place. Instead, they designed a system where the faster the train moved, the easier it became to hold up. Here's how it works. The train carries magnets, but not ordinary ones. They're so powerful they have to be cooled to hundreds of degrees below freezing before they can operate. And instead of running on a flat rail, the train travels inside a U-shaped concrete guideway lined with loops of wire. As it races past, those powerful magnets create electric currents in the loops, and those currents generate magnetic forces that push back on the train. And those walls do two jobs at the same time. They lift the train up and they push it back toward the middle. Drift a little to the left, and the right wall pulls while the left wall shoves. The train is constantly, automatically correcting itself thousands of times every second. Now here's the part that turns everything upside down. A normal train becomes harder to push faster the quicker it goes. This one does the opposite. The faster it moves, the stronger the magnetic forces holding it in place become. So at full speed, it isn't teetering on a knife edge. It is cradled by force on every side. And because nothing is touching, there is nothing left to slip. The wall from the last section, the one hiding inside the wheel, simply vanishes. It even starts like a plane, rolling along on rubber tires. Then at around 150 kilometers an hour, it lifts off, rises about 10 centimeters, and never touches down again until it slows back down. There's another advantage people rarely think about. Because the train is guided inside a U-shaped channel by magnetic forces on every side, the risk of derailment is dramatically reduced compared with a conventional railway. One of rail travel's oldest fears becomes far less likely. So the floating was solved. Japan hit 603 kilometers an hour back in 2015, more than a decade ago. Which leaves one strange question. If the impossible part was cracked all those years ago, why has the hardest part of this whole project turned out to be something that doesn't move at all? The answer is strange, because the hardest part of this whole project isn't the train at all. It's the ground it has to run through. Here's what almost nobody realizes. Everyone looks at the floating train and assumes that's the miracle. It isn't. The train was the easy part. The real nightmare was carving a path through Japan itself. Look at where this railway goes. To connect Tokyo and Nagoya, it doesn't snake around hills and valleys. It runs almost dead straight. And that straightness comes at a price. At 500 kilometers an hour, even a gentle curve becomes a problem. To hold that speed, the line has to stay almost perfectly straight. And a straight line doesn't go around mountains, it goes through them. So the straighter you force the railway, the harder the mountains fight back. That's why nearly 9 out of every 10 kilometers of this railway disappears underground. Japan isn't simply laying track across the country, it's drilling its way through it. Much of the route passes beneath the Southern Alps, some of the toughest terrain in the nation. In places, more than a kilometer of solid rock sits above the tunnel ceiling. Then came the dispute that stopped the entire project. One stretch, less than 9 kilometers long, passes beneath Shizuoka Prefecture, where tunneling raised fears about reducing the flow of the Oi River. That river supplies drinking water, irrigates tea fields and farms, and supports hundreds of thousands of people downstream. The train wouldn't even stop in Shizuoka. The prefecture would carry the environmental risk without receiving a station in return, so the governor refused to approve the work. That single decision stalled the project for almost 9 years. It was only broken in the summer of 2026. On top of that, some of the rock turned out to be far more fragile than the engineers had planned for, dragging other sections back even further. So step back and look at the real picture. The record-breaking train was ready years ago. What wasn't ready was everything around it. A tunnel delayed by fragile rock. A river people refused to risk. Years of negotiations, lawsuits, and excavation, the engineering outran the ground, which forces a much bigger question. Nobody fights a mountain for 9 years and buries $100 billion underground just to save a little time and win a speed record. So what is this train actually for? On the surface, the answer is simple: speed. This is what all that pain buys. Today, the bullet train from Tokyo to Nagoya takes about 90 minutes. On this line, it takes about 40. Tokyo to Osaka drops to roughly 67 minutes. A trip that used to be a proper journey becomes shorter than many people's daily commute. And that sounds like nothing more than better transport. But numbers like that quietly change where people choose to live, where companies decide to grow, and how an entire country thinks about distance. When two cities sit 40 minutes apart, they stop behaving like two cities at all. You could live in one and work in the other and never think twice. A business in Nagoya and a business in Tokyo start acting like they share a street. Line up Tokyo, Nagoya, and Osaka at this speed, and you no longer have 3 separate cities. You have one enormous megacity, home to tens of millions of people, that you can cross in the time it takes to watch a single TV episode. It quietly redraws the economic map of Japan. And that's the story every headline tells. The speed, the record, 40 minutes, the future of travel. And every one of these claims is true, but they're only part of the story. Speed is the reason they tell you. It's the headline. It's why you clicked on this video. It is not the reason Japan is spending $100 billion on this railway. To understand that, you have to stop thinking about how fast this train goes and start asking what it's really standing in for, because Japan didn't build this out of ambition. It built it out of dread. Dread of something buried deep in the ground beneath the country. Something that hasn't happened yet, but absolutely will. This was never a story about speed. Start with one uncomfortable fact. Almost half of Japan's entire population and a huge share of everything its economy produces is packed into a single corridor: Tokyo, Nagoya, Osaka. And for 60 years, the lifeline tying those cities together has been one railway. The original bullet train opened in 1964, one line, 6 decades old, carrying the lifeblood of the whole country. Now here's the part that changes everything. That railway runs along Japan's Pacific coast, directly through the region where scientists have warned for decades that a massive undersea earthquake is overdue. Not a maybe, a when. Now hold those two facts together. A nation's economic heart beating through a single 60-year-old artery laid directly across the path of a disaster everyone knows is coming. One line. Everything depends on it. If that line breaks, it doesn't just delay trains. It can break the connection between the cities that keep Japan moving. People can't travel. Goods can't move. Businesses slow down. And everyone knows that one day, the ground will test that connection. That's what this train really is. Not a speed machine, a spare. A second artery, deliberately routed inland and buried deep underground, where earthquake shaking is much weaker than at the surface. And that magnetic guidance system from earlier? It was never only about speed. A train held securely inside its guideway, constantly recentering itself, is exactly the kind of design you'd want during an earthquake. The same engineering that makes it incredibly fast is the engineering that could help keep it running when the old line cannot. Japan began chasing this idea in 1962. Many of the people who first imagined it will never ride it. The first paying passengers aren't expected until the 2030s. It's a project one generation began, knowing another generation would be the one to inherit it. A second heart for a country, waiting on an earthquake. Which almost makes the floating train sound like the least remarkable thing about it. But every project this ambitious comes with trade-offs. And this one has plenty. So before we call it the future, it's worth asking the harder question: what does this train quietly cost? And what can it still not do? So is this floating super train the effortless miracle it sounds like? Honestly, no. Not quite. Start with the strangest catch of all. You will barely get to see the thing everyone came for. Almost the entire line runs through tunnels, so most of the journey is spent watching concrete walls race past your window at 500 kilometers an hour. The train floats. You just rarely get to watch it do it. And there is a quiet irony buried in that. This train passes right by Mount Fuji, one of the most beautiful sights on Earth, and you will see almost none of it. The spectacle is real. You just don't get to watch it. Then comes the part that surprises people most. You would assume a sleek, floating magnetic train uses less energy. It doesn't. At full speed, it actually uses more energy per passenger than the ordinary bullet train it was built to relieve. And a big reason is those same tunnels. Forcing a train through the trapped air inside a tunnel at 500 kilometers an hour takes an enormous amount of force. Speed comes with a fuel bill, and this one is steep. Then there is the money and the weight. This line was once promised for 2027. Now the earliest anyone dares say is the mid-2030s. The cost has already roughly doubled from the original estimate, and it climbs higher every time the mountain fights back. So here's the honest rethink. The magic was never free. The speed, the dead straight line, the floating. Every part of it is paid for somewhere else, in energy, in money, and in years of delay. This isn't a magic carpet. It's one of the most ambitious infrastructure projects ever attempted, and it just happens to float. Which leaves one final question. Japan is spending nearly $100 billion on a railway built for the next century in a country with fewer people in it every single year. So who exactly is this train being built for? It's a fair question, and the honest answer isn't comfortable. Because the trade-offs here are real and worth saying out loud. Start with the money. This is a fortune spent on a sliver of a country. Those tunnels don't just steal the view. They're among the most expensive parts of the entire project, and the fragile rock keeps forcing delays no one can fully predict. In the end, tens of billions of dollars are being spent to connect just 3 cities. Then there's the power. The faster it runs, the more energy it uses. So yes, it's incredibly fast. But it isn't the clean, efficient leap many people imagine when they picture the future. Then the ticket. Riders are expected to pay more than they already do for the premium bullet train, for a journey they will spend staring at tunnel walls. And underneath all of that sits a heavier worry. Japan's population is falling. Every yen poured into this one corridor between Tokyo and Osaka is a yen not spent on the local railways that many smaller towns still depend on. Critics argue that concentrating so much investment in one part of the country quietly pulls people, businesses, and opportunity away from everywhere else. And one caution worth naming: a train that floats at 600 kilometers an hour sells itself. It is easy to oversell. The honest version is quieter than the headline. Not a miracle that changes everything overnight, but a second railway built so that one disaster doesn't bring an entire country to a halt. The extraordinary speed is real. It just isn't the whole story. And yet none of that makes it a mistake. It makes it a bet. A bet on a disaster that hasn't happened yet. A bet placed by people who know they may never live to see it pay off. Which leaves one last question worth sitting with. What kind of country pours everything it has into surviving a day it hopes never comes? Step back from the magnets, the tunnels, the record. We tend to measure great engineering by numbers: the fastest, the tallest, the first. And by that measure, this train certainly belongs in the record books. But that turns out to be the least interesting thing about it. Because what Japan is really doing here is quieter, stranger, and braver than any speed record. It is building a second spine for an entire country before the earthquake that could break the first. It is spending a fortune and 30 years on insurance against a day that may not even come in the lifetime of the people paying for it. The floating was only ever the headline. The real invention was resilience. And look at how they got there. Not by chasing speed for its own sake, but by looking at their country's greatest strength, a single railway connecting its biggest cities, and admitting it was also its greatest weakness. One line is fast. One line is also fragile. Maybe that's the real lesson, and it's far bigger than trains. The most important things we build aren't the ones that win the race. They're the ones we build in calm times, for storms we know will come, and hand quietly to people we'll never meet. A train that floats above the track, so a country does not fall when the ground finally moves.